and welcome to our lecture series, Ancient Egyptian VIPs. Today we're looking at a very special pharaoh. His name, at least, was at some point Akhnaten. And to know how he got there, let's start at the beginning. He is the son of Pharaoh Amenhotep III and his great royal wife, Tai. Now, we do know that Tai was not of royal birth. We know the names of her parents. Her father was a priest of Min in Akhmim and a master of the horse. His name was Yuya and his wife was called Tuya. Their eldest son was called Tutmosis. We see him here on a relief that you can admire here in our museum. We see him here in the regalia of the high priest of Ptah. He's right behind his father, the pharaoh. And this probably came from a chapel for the burial of the Apis bull. We don't know exactly when, but young Prince Tutmosis did not survive to the death of his father, and instead his younger brother, Amenhotep, became the heir. Now, it seems as though Amenhotep III, his father, made him pharaoh before he actually died. This was not unusual. It's called co-regency. We know it from the 12th dynasty. We also know it from certain other pharaohs in the New Kingdom. And what we don't know is exactly how long this co-regency went. Possibly up to 8 years. So for a time, it seems as if Amenhotep IV reigned together with his father until his father's death. He did not reign alone. He had a wife with the lovely name, the beautiful woman has come, Nefertiti. What we don't know is where she came from. We do know that she is not a princess. She was not a king's daughter or king's sister. The usual titles for a queen who came from the royal family. We do know the name of her wet nurse, but unfortunately we don't know for certain who her parents were. Now, during the first 4 years of his reign, he starts on his big project. This starts rather innocuously with the building of a new temple. This was nothing new in ancient Egypt. Pharaohs were constantly building temples. And in fact, a temple had already been built to that god at the emplacement where this temple would be. You see the little red X next to the complex of Amun-Re in Karnak, in Luxor today. This is where a little chapel to the Aten used to sit. The Aten was a form of the sun god. It was known since the 12th dynasty. It's one of the many shapes and forms the sun god could take, and in this case specifically, the sun god as the disk in the sky that you can see with the naked eye. What Akhnaten did was build a very new kind of temple and with a very new kind of art, as we shall see later. However, it was nothing unusual to have smaller temples or chapels to various forms of various gods, so for now this was nothing unusual. What happens between year 4 and 6 is a complete revolution. A lot of things happen one right after the other. Amenophis IV changed his name. He was no longer Amun is content, Amenhotep, but instead Akhenaten. An Akh is a kind of spirit or soul of the ancient Egyptians. The gods were thought to have them too. So Akhenaten was, to a certain extent, designating himself as a version of the god Aten, as a soul of the god Aten. And his wife, Nefertiti, kept her name but added a moniker, namely Neferu Aten, the most beautiful of the beauties of the Aten. Not only did they change their names, they decided to move to a new capital. Until then, ancient Egypt had an administrative capital in Memphis, around where Cairo is now, and a religious capital in Thebes, and the king divided his time between the two. What Akhnaten did was bring them both together to a space in Middle Egypt that until now had not had any larger towns. He called this new city the Horizon of the Aten, Akhnaten. Today we also call it Amarna because that's the name of a modern village there. We see that it had border stela all around that delimited where exactly this new capital would end. And it had various districts, including a royal palace and several temples to the Aten. Now, what he was doing here was not only concentrating the administrative and religious centers of Egypt, but he was also uprooting all the courtiers who were divided between Memphis and Thebes and bringing them together in one place, a bit like Louis XIV did with Versailles. He was taking them away from their power base and bringing them directly under the aegis of the king. Because he had to build everything from scratch, he also had to find little tricks so that building could advance more quickly. For the normal buildings, this was not a problem because they were made of mud brick, and mud brick construction happened pretty quickly. However, for the temples, this was more of a problem as they usually involved big stone blocks that were several tons of weight. What he did was reduce the size of the blocks to about 56 times 27 times 27 centimeters, and all in all they weighed about 50 kilos, which is a little less than a me. This meant that two people could easily carry one block of stone, and construction could go forward quite quickly. Until now, we only saw the Aten as one form of the sun god. But Akhnaten decided that it would also be the only form of the sun god and the only god in Egypt at all. This was the first recorded instance of monotheistic religion in the ancient world. This was a god that you could see. This was the god as the sun disk in the sky. And you could feel the results of his power through the warmth of the sun on your skin, through the air that you breathed, and through the light with which you could see. This sun god was considered the ruler of Egypt, if you like. He had his own cartouches with his own names, just like the king had a throne name and a birth name that were written in cartouches. The first one was Horus in the horizon lives, the one in the horizon jubilates, in his name of Shu, who is in the sun disk. Starting the year 9, it was changed to take away the name of Shu, which was, although it was a god that was said to emanate from the sun, was in many instances of ancient Egyptian thought also considered a separate god, and instead his name was Re, ruler of the horizon lives, who jubilates in the horizon, in his name of Re, the father, who became as the sun disk, as the Aten. In establishing this single god, he, over the course of his reign, started to eliminate the other gods. He did this by closing temples, one after the other, not all at once, because temples in ancient Egypt were an economic unit and economic center that produced, among other things, chariots for the military and luxury goods. They owned a lot of land, so closing them all at once would have plunged Egypt into an economic disaster. Instead, one after the other, he closed them and replaced them with Aten temples elsewhere in Egypt. What he also did is have the name of Amun, the main god of Egypt previously, taken out of prominently displayed inscriptions. So here we have two. This was a stela that was in a fairly prominent place, and in the temple of Luxor itself, inside the name of his own father, we have the throne name Nebmat Re, and then the moniker Mary Amun, beloved of Amun, and the name Amun was scratched out. Of course, a new god needs a new temple, needs a new type of temple. And although the general layout is very reminiscent of the ancient Egyptian temples previously, we still have the entrance pylons as a monumental entrance. We still have a succession of rooms along a processional axis. It's no longer a procession of smaller and darker rooms until you come to the room with the shrine, in which the small statue of the god would have stood. The ancient Egyptians thought that these statues would then take a part of the soul of the god, and the god could then receive offerings. But we have a god who is ever present, whose sunlight is everywhere. Therefore, we don't need a statue. We don't need an inner sanctum. We can keep the entire temple open to the sky. It was filled with smaller altars, several large ones. If you look upon the plan as well, you can see them, on which the offerings were placed, and it was thought that the Aten would then receive these offerings by shining his light upon them. Now, a religious reform is all well and good, and of course all the courtiers would follow suit and pledged allegiance to the new god. However, within Amarna itself, within the capital of Akhnaten, in the workers' homes, there were found a number of amulets that still reference the old gods. Here you can see one in the middle. It's a little figure with a tambourine. It's the god Bes. And it was mostly amulets of the smaller household gods. Bes, who was a protector of the household, or Toeris, who was the goddess who protected mothers in childbirth and younger children. However, when we go further away from the capital, we notice that people still clung to their old beliefs, including the old funerary beliefs. In Amarna, it was thought that the spirits of the dead would partake in the big offerings to the Aten, and that they wouldn't go in a dark underworld, but would remain and be renewed by the Aten himself. However, here on the right, we have a nice relief from our museum again. A young man called Ipi, who was scribe in a temple of the Aten in Rike, so not one of the main Aten temples in Karnak or in Akhnaten. And he is shown kneeling before a table full of offerings. The god to which he is praying has not survived, but his name has, and it's the old ruler of the underworld, Osiris. So even somebody working in a temple for the Aten still held on to some of the old beliefs. A new religion, a new way of thinking, a new philosophy, a new capital, and of course, all that needs to be expressed in some fashion. A new form of propaganda. Here we see some reliefs from the Temple of the Aten in Karnak. And on the left, you see a relief in the traditional style. The sun god is shown as a falcon-headed man with the sun disk on his head. And on the right, you see the new format of talatats, of smaller blocks. And if you can see that the god is shown as the sun disk with the rays falling down upon the king. And the whole style is quite unique. Here we see a relief and a statue of Akhnaten in the new style. We see that the limbs are all quite thin. Generally, it's a very gracile profile, except in the area of the hips and buttocks, which is quite full. The face has a very typical and very easily recognizable profile, with a long chin, with very fleshy lips, with a long nose, thin elongated eyes, and generally just a very thin and emaciated appearance. On the right, these are some of the, we see this and this one are some of the colossi of Akhnaten from his temple in Karnak. And as you can see, some of them are naked and they don't have any male genitalia. Some authors believe that this was due to some sort of physical syndrome, to some sort of genetic defect in Akhnaten himself. Others believe that he was trying to express something that he had written down in the great hymn to the Aten, namely that the Aten, and thus Akhnaten himself, was father and mother to all creation, and therefore gave Akhnaten a more feminine appearance in order to make him a mother as well. Now, the thing that speaks against Akhnaten having some sort of physical deformity is the fact that in the latter part of his reign, the art changes and is more attenuated. We see on the left the early pieces, and on the right a later piece that is now in Berlin. And you can see that all the elements are still there. He still has a fairly prominent chin, he still has fleshy lips, a fairly long, thin nose, long, thin eyes, but it all looks more like something that you would see in the subway. And in fact, I have sat in front of somebody who looked exactly like that. On the right, you can see the same in relief. You can see the more exaggerated version at the beginning of his reign and the somewhat attenuated, more realistic version at the end of his reign, a very lovely relief that you can also see here in our museum. Another thing that speaks against it is that everybody was depicted that way, including Nefertiti. You can see her on the left in the old style and on the right in one of our lovely reliefs in the new style. The fact that this depiction was deliberate and was symbolic can at best be seen in the depictions of their daughters. They are always, or almost always, shown with a shaved head and always shown with the lock of youth. Now later on, the lock of youth would be a kind of symbol or attribute of the royal children, but before Akhnaten, this was not usual. This was really only a type of hairdo that was worn by small children before they reached puberty. However, this small child has all the curves of a burgeoning adult. And at the same time, they have very long elongated skulls in the back. Now, there is absolutely no evidence that the ancient Egyptians practiced skull deformation at any time. However, what do we have here? We have youth, we have puberty and fertility, and now we have birth. It can happen that in the birth canal, the skull is somewhat deformed. This has to do because the fontanelles are not closed, so the skull, the various plates of the skull can deform. It happened with my eldest child. He was born with a very nice Amarna skull. It takes a few hours and then the skull looks completely normal. So in order to show this cycle of birth and rebirth that is so central to the religion of Amarna, the Aten was a god of creation who constantly created the world anew. And to express that, the royal family changed their public appearance in reliefs and in statuary to reflect that. Because we're talking about his daughters, we might as well present them. The eldest was called Merit Aten. She first appeared in about year 5. We don't know if they appeared when they were first born or when they were a bit older, but the first reliefs with Merit Aten appear in about year 5, Makhet Aten a year later in year 6, Aten, who's playing with her mother's earring and would later marry Tutankhamun, between years 6 and 7. Then on the right, you have the 3 younger princesses. You have Neferneferu Aten Tasherit, or if you like, Nefertiti Jr., who appears between the years 9 and 10. We have Neferneferu Re and Setepen Re, who appear between the years 10 and 12. So while they were busy making a family, the world around Akhnaten did not stop revolving. And in fact, we have a very unique find of diplomatic correspondence from that time. And these are all from the the small city-states along the Levant and the Near East. There are various things. There are diplomatic marriages. There are some an exchange of diplomatic gifts. And more a demand for troops. What was happening is that the Hittite Empire was forming and expanding, thus putting pressure on all those little city-states. And they would send letters to Egypt in Akkadian cuneiform, begging for troops, charioteers, but mostly archers. And from the increasing desperation in these letters, it appears that they did not get them for whatever reason. Possibly because Akhnaten had his own problems. In year 12, he has a great festival for the Aten. This is actually a Sed festival, a jubilee, which the king usually instigated in the year 30 of his reign. But this was not for the king, this was for the Aten. We don't know why he chose year 12. It is possible that he was counting from the foundation of the first chapel of the Aten or some other important date in the cult of the Aten that we are not privy to. Or this was a way to distract from certain problems. It was definitely a very big festival. We see the bringing of diplomatic gifts from the Levant and from the south. Some of these are tribute, at least those from the northern part of the northern Sudan, where Egypt, which was a colony of Egypt, if you like, at the time. However, the others, although they're presented as tribute, were very probably simply diplomatic gifts. In year 14, tragedy strikes in the death of the second eldest daughter. Her name is Akhnaten, and we know that sometime shortly afterwards, the two youngest daughters died as well. There are some evidence for a plague or some kind of pandemic in Egypt at the time. What is interesting is that it is around this time as well that the historical record of Nefertiti ends. At her place comes Akhnaten's eldest daughter, married Aten. She is now shown in the role of the great royal wife, occasionally replacing reliefs of Nefertiti herself. This has led some to believe that Nefertiti fell into disfavor. It seems more likely that either she was dead or it is possible that she became a co-regent of Akhnaten. Now, Akhnaten's reign ends in year 17. We have a wine docket in which the year 17 of Akhnaten is equated with the year 1 of Tutankhamun, then still called Tutankhaten. However, we do have evidence for one or maybe two kings in between who were either erased by Tutankhamun, who simply said, okay, they did not exist, I'm putting my first year of reign as in the last year of Akhnaten, or who were co-regents to Akhnaten. It's a very complex and a very fascinating thing for which we don't really have the time, but suffices to say that we have two kings with the same name, the same throne name. Ankheperure Neferneferu Aten, and we know this name as being one of the names of Nefertiti. And this Ankheperure occasionally writes their name in the feminine version. And then we have Ankheperure Smenkhare, who is shown with married Aten, Akhnaten's eldest daughter, as their great royal wife. Unfortunately, this would be a whole other lecture to try and present the evidence for and against who they might be, who they are. Suffices to say that the end of the reign of Akhnaten is just as fascinating as the emergence of the Aten in his first years. And it all, however, is erased when one of his sons from another wife, very likely his sister, a young boy called Akhnaten ascends the throne at the age of about 9. He would then change his name to Tutankhamun, return to the old gods, and return the capital to Memphis and Thebes. I hope you've had a nice overview of the reign of Akhnaten. Of course, this is only a very succinct and quick overview. If you want to know more, come to our museum. Thank you.